If you are thinking of trying a neuroplasticity program for an illness like ME-CFS or long COVID, there are so many options now that it can be hard to know where to begin. But one way to help whittle down the possible choices is to be aware of certain red flags, things that might raise alarm bells about specific programs and which can help you to avoid going down a particular route which may only ever cause you a lot more trouble than it's worth, and an approach which might be very costly on your wallet. In this video, I'm going to share with you some of the red flags that I think you might want to look out for before making a decision. But first, my name is Patrick Usher, and I am author of the book Understanding ME-CFS and Strategies for Healing, in which I break down some of the latest, most exciting research into ME-CFS and long COVID, as well as talking about the various treatment strategies that I have tried in order to improve my own condition. The links for that book are down below. Now, regular viewers of this channel will know that I am quite critical of the typical ME-CFS neuroplasticity narrative. I think that it makes very little effort to actually situate itself within the research into ME-CFS and can make some very outlandish claims. On the flip side, I do regard neuroplasticity as valid, and I do think that it can be helpful for these kinds of illnesses and that there are maladaptive neuroplastic problems that can be occurring. While many ME-CFS brain retraining programs might not make a huge effort in terms of trying to situate their programs within the research of the conditions that they are treating, there are some cases, I believe, where the red flags are so egregious that it's very important to actually be aware of them so as to potentially save yourself from going down a path that you might only ever regret. Let's get to the red flags. The first one is what might be called the great clarifier. Now, it is my belief that no matter what someone says, if they are selling something, the great thing that reveals their motivations is what it is actually priced at. The more established neuroplasticity programs tend to have a price point somewhere between $220 and $400. And while that's still a significant chunk of change, it can be argued that that's a reasonably fair price and that it's not in principle excluding, huge amounts of patients from being able to do such programs, that it is therefore trying to reach a large enough amount of people, and that given that, the people who run these programs, they also have to make their living, they have to pay their taxes, they have, they'll have plenty of expenses and so on, that actually, it can be argued that those prices are reasonably fair. And in fact, there also exists at least one program that I know of, and I'll talk about some programs towards the end that I think are worth checking out. There also exists one program that also has options for people from low income backgrounds, where you actually get a very significant discount on a program that is already priced low in comparison to others. That can be argued to be, roughly speaking, fair. However, what we are seeing increasingly now are programs that are charging $700-800, over $1,000. Sometimes they're even charging multiple thousands of dollars, like $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, just not even for access to the whole program forever, but like just for a year. And to my mind, if you're seeing that kind of price point, I would encourage anyone to be very cautious, because it's hard for me to see how, looking at the landscape of the ME-CFS world, considering the suffering, the desperation, the fact that many people have lost their livelihoods, they may be having to rely on, handouts from the state or whatever, going into the ME-CFS world and pricing a program like that, well, it's either doing one of two things: targeting people who are very desperate and who have some savings, or targeting people who have a fair bit of money to spare. What it's not doing is setting out with a mission to actually help people from a range of backgrounds, from in principle most backgrounds, or hopefully all backgrounds. So it's not setting out with that mission in mind. It's setting out instead with the profit motive and trying to find, the demographic that can respond to that. And look, there's nothing wrong with charging money for services, but the price needs to be fair. So I would regard, first and foremost, the great clarifier of the cost of a program as very important to bear in mind. And that no matter what else the people pushing that program might be saying, bear in mind that the real great thing that reveals motivations is how much something actually costs. The second major red flag, and this is something that sadly may apply to quite a lot of programs, but there are certain, perhaps, some programs might do this worse than others, shall we say. What I think is another major red flag is if the claim is made that the only problem, the sole problem in these kinds of illnesses is a hypersensitive nervous system, that there's nothing else going on, at all, apart from perhaps deconditioning, and that basically all of the symptoms are being created by a hypersensitive brain, including when you crash, that all of that is just symptoms created by the brain. Now, this is actually unforgivable because there is so much research showing, a full range of further mechanisms within illnesses like ME-CFS that are causing the symptoms. For example, low blood volume, autoantibodies that burrow into your heart and blood vessels and which cause those areas to dysfunction, microclots which get into your blood and condense them and make them sluggish and increase the exercise intolerance. And even down when we're talking about post-exertional malaise, we know that actually involves muscle tissue necrosis, muscle tissue death, likely caused by calcium overload in the muscles. I did a previous video on that. If people are making these kinds of claims, what that tells you is, first of all, they're selling very simple answers, which are enticing to people who are desperate and who are looking for answers, but it also tells you that these people cannot be bothered to go and read any of the research. So that's another major red flag. If they are putting out a program for ME-CFS, they should at least do some basic reading into what the scientists who have been working on this condition have actually been uncovering, rather than just saying, I know the answer, it's nothing to do with what any of the researchers are saying, it's just this. It shows that it's someone who's not prepared to actually have some basic humility to actually look at what has been discovered in relation to these highly complex illnesses. And this can be very problematic when people are coming to these coaches with symptoms, because the coach will be saying it's only your hypersensitive nervous system, whereas in actual fact it could be a whole range of other things causing those symptoms. For example, someone with very low blood volume, because people with ME can have, up to a litre, if not more, less blood than normal, is going to these people and saying, I feel my nervous system is just in overdrive and, I've got all these horrible symptoms and I feel ghastly. And they're saying, it's just your hypersensitive nervous system, but actually, when you have very bad low blood volume, it freaks out your brain and it causes major stress in your nervous system because your brain and nervous system does not have enough blood to work with. So there'll be a profound mismatch between what's actually causing someone their problem and what the coach is saying back to them. And in some cases, that can actually be dangerous. Similarly, when programs have that kind of approach, they often also dismiss other treatments. And to my mind, we need to be open to a range of treatments, given that there can be a range of problems that are ongoing in these kinds of illnesses. Now, some people, it's absolutely true, recover mainly from using brain retraining, and more power to them. And I'm not someone to argue with success. But for a lot of people, especially if they've been ill for a longer period of time or they've been more severely ill, they may need to think about employing other treatment strategies concurrently in order to make progress. And hopefully these treatments will be temporary. You may be taking a medication that you can taper off later, or perhaps doing a certain procedure which is just a once-off but can help your overall physiology work better and be more likely to move forward. If programs are kind of dismissing the value of a multilateral approach to recovery, of actually recognizing that the more things you might have on your side, the better as you try to move forward, that's also another red flag. And often again, it's pushed by people who believe the only issue is the hypersensitive nervous system. And that makes sense that they would say that because they believe that's the only problem, so why bother taking any other treatments? But actually, it ain't the case that that's the only problem, and other treatments can be helpful in allowing people to move forward, particularly if they are done in a strategic way, knowingly using a kind of multilateral approach towards recovery, and with the view, ideally, of actually tapering off them when you're feeling better. I think another red flag is when programs dismiss the potential severity or significance of post-exertional malaise. Now, I do believe that it's important that we keep moving, and that we, don't sink into the deconditioning trap. I've been there, and it took me a long time to kind of get out of it. And, but we need to move in ways that are realistic given the nature of our illness. I've done a previous video on how I've gone about that. But basically, post-exertional malaise is no joke. And a lot of these kind of concerning programs will suggest that post-exertional malaise is only created by the brain. It's simply kind of a manifestation of a nervous system that is kind of almost like afraid of exercise. There's nothing wrong with you to cause post-exertional malaise apart from the nervous system being too sensitive to the physical load of the activity, and therefore that you kind of shouldn't fear PEM. And again, this is like wildly wrong in terms of the pathophysiology of the illness, because we know that muscle tissue necrosis is actually what occurs during PEM, and that's basically when muscle tissues die. And basically, the reason it feels so awful is primarily because you suddenly have these dead muscle fibers which your body then has to regenerate. This ludicrous claim can be very dangerous, because when you crash, not only do you get this muscle tissue necrosis, but you damage the mitochondria, you reduce their quantities. And mitochondria are what you need to create ATP, which is crucial, for recovery. Without sufficient ATP, the energy crisis never heals. So to have this kind of super relaxed or debonair or laissez-faire attitude about post-exertional malaise can be pretty dangerous. One should be wary of it. And ultimately, I think that programs that are encouraging people to actually avoid crashing for a significant length of time, while also gradually expanding your activity, are actually much more in tune with the nature of ME-CFS. Basically, anyone who minimizes PEM is also minimizing the role of mitochondrial healing, which is obviously needed given the nature of the disease. Finally, another thing that can often come through in these programs is it's your fault if you're not making progress. You're not doing the exercises enough. And this is another red flag, because really for all the reasons I've mentioned, these illnesses are so complex. Even though there is a maladaptive neuroplastic state, I believe, going on in these conditions, and even if for the sake of argument it's the root cause, let's just say that it is, there can develop a situation where the other burdens that develop are so strong, it's very hard to get out of it. I'm not saying it's impossible. I think we must always have hope. Things can get really bad with the other dysfunctions. And they might then become so strong that even though they weren't the root cause, they may actually be the factor that is limiting progress. So if anyone's saying, it's your fault because you're not doing my program well enough, that's another big red flag. So you come to wrapping up this video now. Where does that leave us? So let's say there's a program where the motivations are pretty decent, structure is pretty good, it's pretty established, etc. But maybe it's not it's not coming at things from a very robust angle in terms of situating its program into the research. I think that you can nevertheless benefit from such a program as long as you know what you're doing. I think one is better off going for the more established programs, the programs that have been around a long time, on which there is more information and which are, as I say, generally fairly priced. So things like the Gupta program, DNRS, Dynamic Neural Retraining System, ANS Rewire from Dan Neufer. I think these are programs that are worth considering. I think that in general they're more open to the fact that there are more things going on, particularly Dan Neufer's program. He's very much an advocate of a multilateral approach. He talks about a range of other dysfunctions that develop. He very much thinks in terms of primary and secondary. And I think that that's a really decent effort within this kind of landscape. Meanwhile, I've heard, Annie Hopper over at the DNRS, for example, saying that, the limbic system impairment hypothesis can be related to the cell danger response and to the mitochondrial dysfunction that develops. So there is actually a recognition that it ain't just the brain. And I think that all of these programs can have helpful exercises that, can help you to effect neuroplastic change, and which you can still do while being aware yourself of the broader picture, the nature of these kinds of illnesses. And finally, there's also the programs of Dr. Eleanor Stein. She has one on chronic pain, so particularly looking at the fibromyalgia aspect. And she also has a beginner's course to neuroplasticity, which I believe is the lowest priced of all these kinds of programs. And she's the person whom I mentioned earlier that has the options for quite significant further reductions for those who are struggling financially. So I would certainly recommend also going to check out her programs. So anyway, Those are my thoughts on ones that, are worth looking at. But basically, otherwise, watch out for very high price programs. Watch out for people who are saying the only issue is a hypersensitive nervous system, basically indicating that they can't be arsed to just go and read research for 10 minutes. And watch out for situations where, problems that develop are dismissed, other treatments are dismissed, you only need to do my program, etc., etc. These are all red flags. Think critically for yourself. When it comes to the other programs that may be more worth checking out, still keep thinking critically for yourself. Recognise the value of what is being offered. Recognise that the most important thing is actually to drive the neuroplastic change, to affect that part of the cycle. But be aware of, how complex these illnesses are at the same time. So that's it for this video, and I will see you in the next one.